What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and tonight we have a discussion with Will from Catholicism WOW. And we're going to be discussing whether or not Jesus was a myth. Will saw one of my videos on mythicism, the one where I was responding to Holy Kool-Aid, and he had some disagreements with me. So I figured that I'd take some notes and see if he could come on to the channel so that we could have like a dialogue back and forth, a discussion about it. Now, will you introduce yourself to people that may not know you on the channel here?
Yeah, my name's Will. Like John said, my channel is called Catholicism WOW. I'm a Catholic apologist, a budding Catholic apologist. I'm very new to this. John is actually the first atheist that I've had a dialogue with in a public sphere, so this will be interesting. But yeah, mostly I try to defend the Catholic faith, and then also try to knock down Protestant nonsense. That's mostly what I do. So,
okay, all right. Now I'm kind of curious, where did you come up with how did you come up with the Catholicism WOW?
I stole that from Kevin Smith.
Yeah, from Dogma. I know that Dogma had a Catholicism
WOW.
I didn't know if it came from that movie, but that's cool that
when you watch my the intro to my my YouTube videos, I actually have the Buddy Christ in my So yeah, I stole it from Kevin Smith. I'm probably the only Catholic in the entire world that doesn't think Dogma is like the most blasphemous movie in the world. I mean, mostly just because it has a rubber poop monster. You can't take it that seriously. And if you're getting your theology from Kevin Smith movies, you're already very, very in a bad way. So, but yeah, I think Dogma is a funny movie. So.
Yeah. Dogma was a really, really good movie. I'm glad that you're not so serious that you can't, laugh with it.
And I wasn't raised a Catholic. I converted. So when Dogma came out, I was 18 and not a Catholic. So maybe that has something to do with it. It wasn't offensive to me when I was 18. So,
I mean, I was raised Catholic and I thought the movie was funny as hell. Just in my own opinion, but so in any case, we're talking about whether or not Jesus existed, and you had a number of issues with my video response to Holy Kool-Aid, and I'm just wondering if because this one of the things that was kind of your running theme in the video was just that I had no basis for what I was saying, and that I was pretending that information didn't exist, and a bunch of information was just inconvenient for me. So I chose not to be convinced by it. And I'm just kind of curious if you can acknowledge it all, because you even played a clip in your video acknowledging that where I'm getting my information comes from actual scholars. Can you acknowledge that all of the information that I espouse in my video does come from scholarship, whether you agree with the scholarship or not? Like, it's not just me pulling things out of my butt and discussing it. Like,
I definitely wouldn't say that any of the positive arguments that you do make are just things that you made up. But my problem was that the negative arguments that you make, or the outright dismissal of other scholarly evidence that's there. So I guess my question would be, why are certain scholars trustworthy in one sense, but those same scholars are not trustworthy when it comes to other stuff?
What do you mean? Are you
like Bart Ehrman, for example? Bart Ehrman, I mean, and I get that you can agree with somebody on one thing and disagree with them on other things. Okay, right. There are a great many things that I disagree with Bart Ehrman on, like the pastoral letters being forged. I don't see that as being, a plausible. I don't see there being enough positive evidence for that to be the case. And then also the dating of the Gospels, I disagree with that. But I also, Bart Ehrman acknowledges that just thinking Jesus outright doesn't exist or didn't exist in history is just silly, and it makes you look foolish. So I mean, I guess my thing is, if there's something that I disagree with you on, I have reasons why. And I
Right.
didn't really get a lot of reasons why from your video. It's just you seem to just take the evidence and push it to the side and then say that there's no evidence, except for all the stuff that you push to the side.
Well, I mean, so you understand that I in that video I was responding to specific arguments levied by Holy Kool-Aid, and I
Right.
was speaking to a specific audience that was that's kind of on my level, you know, as far as a lot of these topics that you're talking about, like the pastorals and the gospels and all that. Like I was,
Right.
I
You
was
were preaching
targeting.
to your own respective choir.
Well, not necessarily preaching to my own choir. I was preaching to a group of people that are on the consensus side of those topics. So, like me automatically going into the video and agreeing, like with Thomas, about how the Gospels are not eyewitness accounts and that they're anonymously written, and the pastorals weren't written by Paul. Like I don't have every time I make a video, I don't have to go through all of my reasons for holding those positions. Like I can, if unless the video is directly talking about, like, why the pastorals are written by Paul, then there's no reason for me to mention. Like that just adds a whole bunch of information that's not pertinent to the topic that's being discussed. So
Okay, granted.
just because I don't talk about it in that video doesn't mean that I don't have evidence-based reasons for adhering to that position.
Okay. Well, that's what we can talk about tonight. You made a video responding to a specific video that Thomas made, and I made a video responding to a specific video that you made. So obviously, there's going to be plenty of room for new ground. That's why we're here.
Right. Exactly.
But there also were things that you also said that were factually incorrect. Like you said that, the idea that Jesus was crucified in a celestial manner in the heavens or in the firmament or whatever. You said that comes from St. Paul. That does not come from St. Paul. That actually comes from an apocryphal document called the Ascension of Isaiah.
Well, no, so you'll get pushback from even atheists on that, because there's plenty of atheists that say that the pocket gospel to the Ascension of Isaiah has always been there, and so the Ascension of Isaiah actually has Jesus going all the way down to the earth and being crucified there. But that's not actually how I construct the hypothesis of Paul coming of holding that position. That's
I'm
actually
curious.
hold on. That's actually
Okay.
supporting information that's showing that later Christians developed a similar idea. So therefore, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Paul also thought this. And there's multiple lines of evidence that I can give for why I think that Paul thought that.
But is there anything in Paul's actual writings in the New Testament that would lead you to believe that? Because there's nothing that I've read in the New Testament letters of Paul that would lead me to believe that.
Well, yeah. So when Paul talks about who crucified Jesus, he's very vague and ambiguous about it. So ultimately, all of the base that I'm going off here is that all of the verses in Paul are too ambiguous and vague to make concrete conclusions. So like I'm not saying that there's a concrete evidence that says that Paul was saying this. My position is that they're ambiguous, but I think that considering the surrounding evidence of Paul, things that he says in his in other portions of his letters and everything like that, that Paul most likely would have thought A, B, and C. So that's my technical argument. My technical argument is that these verses in Paul are too vague to make a determination. Therefore, they don't actually help us with determining certain events in history, like Jesus's birth or his death on the cross, as far as like a matter of it be happening on earth as a matter of history.
If your argument were against the virgin birth and we're using Paul as evidence of that, then I would agree with you. Paul never mentions that Jesus was born of a virgin. He never really talks about the Christmas story, but Paul definitely talks about Jesus being born of a woman and being in the likeness of man and being in the flesh. I mean, there's
Oh,
numerous instances, even though Paul, by his own admission, never knew Jesus while he was alive, right? I don't know
right.
necessarily that that means he never saw him in the flesh, because Paul was a Pharisee. So it would make sense that he would at least have seen him around Jerusalem, but maybe he didn't. Let's say he didn't. That's not really, by Paul's own admission, he never met Jesus while he was alive on this earth. So his only encounter with Jesus happened with the celestial vision, and that's absolutely correct. However, he does make numerous references to Jesus having been alive on the earth. He
Right.
talks about knowing Jesus's brother James. He
I
talks
disagree.
about do what? You said you
Sorry, I was
disagree?
just. Well, yeah, I'm going to disagree on every single one of these points. So if you want to
Okay.
lay them out, that's fine.
Well, I mean, if we're using Paul's writings from the New Testament as the evidence that we have for Paul, in Galatians 2, he absolutely talks about knowing Jesus's brother James. He talks
No,
about
Galatians 1, but
okay.
I know what you're referencing, but those two Jameses are different people. So I'm
But
sorry,
no, but
I interrupted.
he says the Lord's brother in the writing, in the text.
Not in Galatians 2. He says that in Galatians 1:19.
Okay, fair enough. So I miscited the reference by a couple of verses, but he does refer to James as the brother of Jesus, and he
No, he
also
doesn't. If I can correct you, he says that he is either however you want to phrase it, the Lord's brother or the brother of the Lord. Either one is grammatically the same, but it does not say the brother of Jesus or the Jesus's brother. Like that particular phrase is not said by Paul.
But he says, "But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother."
The Lord's brother, yeah, the Lord's brother. I mean, not the
So
brother of Jesus, but the Lord's brother.
so how would you interpret that passage? That
Well,
phrasing?
considering that Jesus didn't become Lord until he ascended, until he resurrected and ascended back into heaven. Also, you have to consider the familial the familial language that Paul uses. I mean, do you recall how Paul refers to fellow Christians at the time?
Yeah, he says my brethren and things of that nature. And
Yeah,
and
my
there
brothers
is
and sisters.
and it is open-ended as to whether or not James actually was, an actual brother of Jesus, because I mean, Catholics, we believe that Mary was perpetually a virgin. So she didn't have any children other than Jesus. But it's very open. The church allows to believe that Joseph had children from a previous marriage, and that his brothers could have been that. So, but
Where's
either
that in the
way, though,
evidence?
do what?
Where's that in the evidence, though?
If you're talking about the evidence that we're discussing right here, that's slightly off topic. I'm just
No.
saying, though.
I'm saying the assumption that the assumption that Joseph had children prior to marrying
That
Mary.
comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James,
Oh, okay. So
which is it's not a
nothing cannot
canonical document, but it is a trusted document.
by later Christians in the 2nd century and onward, right?
I mean, I don't know exactly when it was dated. I just know that the church accepts it not as canonical scripture, but as at least reliable enough that we get church tradition out of it. So,
Well, yeah, but I mean, church tradition doesn't necessarily trace back to like whatever actually happened. So, I mean,
right, but
that's
I'm
just
just
not evidence.
right, but I'm also not asserting that as a fact. I'm just saying hypothetically, as a hypothesis, Jesus might have had older brothers. and
but I
older
mean, I
sister.
see in it like that. While that may be possible, like I mean, I think that it would be reasonable to assume that that a Jewish rabbi would have a brother or something like that. Like
But either
I think that's
way,
possible. I think that's possible. I think that you would need evidence in order to suggest that it's probable. Those are two different things. Just because it's possible doesn't mean that it's probable. And
I agree with
also
that.
the Greek words that are used here in this particular section is actually describes either a blood relative or a fictive kinship, considering that
Right,
Paul's use of the fictive kinship for everybody else, it makes it
right,
seem like the distinction that's being made is between an apostle and a general Christian. And
right.
I've
The
never
word
heard
is Adelphos.
right. I've never heard
Yeah.
a solid argument that suggests that it has to mean a literal blood relative. People automatically assume that it means a blood relative without actually making an argument that that's what it means.
No, I totally agree with that because this is an argument that I have with Protestants all day long that deny the perpetual virginity of Mary. But just because when James is referred to as the Lord's brother or the brother of the Lord or whatever, just because the word that's used can be ambiguous, uh, that doesn't. Well, the biggest point is that it's at least somebody that was close to Jesus, if not a brother. So
Well, no,
how
I
is
mean,
that
I don't
not
think that it
evidence?
means that.
How is that not evidence from Paul that Jesus was an actual man?
Well, because Paul referred to other people as brothers, and there's the whole theology of the fact that when you get baptized into the family of God, you become a brother to Jesus.
Right,
You become
right.
part of the family of God. So how do you distinguish between like a physical brother and this fictive kinship
So
that
do you
Paul
not
muddies the
believe
water with?
do you not believe that this James, this other apostle that Paul knew, was one of the original 12 disciples that are mentioned in the Gospels? Because there are two James. You don't believe it's either one of
Right.
those?
Well, no, because I don't think that the apostles ever existed. I don't think the apostles ever existed. No. So
Okay.
sorry, not apostles, disciples. The disciples that are in the Gospels, Paul never references them as disciples. He never references them in a way that would indicate that they ever knew Jesus personally, like while he was alive on earth. So, I mean, I think that the whole idea of Jesus having disciples only comes up later when the Gospels are being written.
So then also again, when Paul references Cephas, then you're going to say that that's not Peter from the Gospels.
I mean, it obviously is Peter, but I think the Gospels took Paul's letters and saw that Peter was one of the preeminent, or maybe they just already knew that Peter was a preeminent founding figure of Christianity, and they made him a disciple. But what I focus on is the evidence that we actually have, and the evidence in Paul never indicates that Peter or Cephas or Cephas, however you pronounce it,
Yeah.
is a disciple. Like he was never a disciple. Also, on that point, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul actually lists the 12 separately from Peter. So, I mean, even if you wanted to assume that there were 12 disciples and that Paul mentions the 12 as being the 12 disciples, that would seem to indicate that Peter was not part of the 12 disciples.
1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah, it's like 3 through 8.
I'm going to look that up. 3 through 8. I'll look that up right now.
Yep.
You don't mind if I look stuff up, do you?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have a positronic brain, so I don't have the entire Bible committed to memory.
I mean, I don't either. I've just had this discussion so many times that I know the
Right.
verses.
Well, right. And then mostly dealing with Protestants who are also believers, a lot of this stuff doesn't come up in my research. So it does say, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that could easily just mean that he appeared to Peter by himself and then he appeared to the 12 together. That doesn't necessarily discount Peter as being part of the 12.
I mean, I agree that you can explain it on both ideas,
Right.
but the 12 is never explicitly identified as being the disciples. There were also 12 tribes of Israel, so I mean, it's
Right,
just
which
as
is why
likely
there
that
are 12
Paul,
disciples.
right, and Paul could easily mean that the 12 are the 12, tribes of Israel. I mean, I do agree that it's possible that there were 12 like disciples, but my point is that there's no evidence given in Paul that disciples were ever a thing. Like
So
he never uses the word disciples.
would you agree that when there is a field of study, whatever that field of study is, and that when there is a consensus within that field of study. So we talked earlier off the air about your flat Earth videos and stuff like that. So obviously the scientific consensus is that the Earth is round. Like to the point where if you believe the Earth is any shape other than round, you look ridiculous.
Well, yeah,
So
but
would
I
you
mean
agree?
that's because of the well, I mean that's because of the direct evidence that we have of
Right.
the
No,
Earth being an
granted,
oblong sphere.
there is physical scientific evidence. I could go outside right now and prove the Earth is round in 15 minutes. But disregarding that, would you agree that in general, if there is a consensus within a certain field of study, that if your hypothesis is contrary to that consensus, that you need to be able to back that hypothesis up with some kind of positive evidence and not just explaining away the evidence that has led to the consensus that we do have. Would you agree
I
with that?
think I mean, I do think that I need to have an argument for my position. Like I need to put forth positive evidence for my position. But I mean, there's Raphael Lataster's questioning the historicity of Jesus that has information in it. There's also this is the pop level version, Jesus from Outer Space of Dr. Carrier's academic book that's much more substantial in its references and its information. But I mean, there's already the positive case that's been made in the academic scholarship that's challenged the consensus. So I think that it's incumbent upon me to be able to provide my positive argument for my position, but also I need to be able to explain why the evidence that the consensus gives isn't sufficient for their conclusion.
Right.
So it's a combination of what you said.
But okay. But it just seems to me, and like I said this in my video that I did responding to you originally, it just seems like you're taking the evidence that's there and just setting it to the side.
But I'm not, because I have reasons for discounting the current evidence. Like we haven't gone through all of the evidence that's normally espoused. So I mean,
Right.
if you have a particular topic that you want to talk about, I'm perfectly fine talking about it. But I'm just going to tell you right now, like I have reasons, argumentation, and evidence.
All right. Let's stick with Paul for a minute, okay? In Galatians 4, chapter 4, Paul writes that Jesus was born of a woman under the law. How does that not explicitly state that he was born a Jew in the flesh, to a human woman under the law of Moses?
Right. So what are the Greek words that are used there for born of a woman?
The Greek words?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to Google that.
Okay, well, generally in that particular portion, which I typically read whenever I look at Paul for these kinds of topics, I look at the interlinear text that has like the Greek word and then what it translates
Right,
into. Because
I've done that. I've done that quite a bit as well. I actually did that in a video I uploaded this morning. But I have to actually Google the passage and click on, the interlinear. I don't have it committed to memory.
right. Well, so for Galatians 4, I believe it's 4:4. When he says born of a woman, he's actually using genomai of a woman. And genomai is a kind of a weird way, if you want to say born, for this particular topic. And that's just dealing with the phrase there. I know born of a woman is a phrase that's used in the Old Testament, most notably in like Job, to refer to somebody of a human origin. But the difference there is that they use the word genao, which is more explicit about being born, and Paul explicitly uses genomai for some reason. And the only other places where Paul uses genomai in reference to bodies is when he's talking about Adam's body, which was manufactured by God, and our future resurrection bodies, which are also manufactured by God. And so it kind of seems like if we're going with the trend there, that it would seem to indicate that he's meaning like a manufactured body whenever he's saying born of a woman, because it's not only in Galatians 4:4 where Paul uses genomai to in a born of the woman sense, he also uses it, I believe, in, well, not exactly. I know it's like in Romans 9:5 maybe. He talks about Jesus being the seed of David, or
Right.
some people
normally. And then in Philippians 2:5-8, he talks about Jesus being born in the form and the likeness of man.
Right. I'm not sure about the Philippians verse, but what I do know is that genomai typically is rendered as made. It can mean to be born.
Right.
That is one particular use of it. But what we have to look at is, how does Paul use the word? How does he use the word in order to indicate this?
And again, I'll just read it. It's just one verse. Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. He says, but when the time had fully come, because he's talking about, the Old Testament and the law and, the Messiah. When the time had fully come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law.
Right.
So
and then
using that context.
Hold on.
Okay.
Hold on. Can you go to 4:24 for me though?
Yeah, Galatians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he says, now this is an allegory. These women are two covenants, but that he's not talking about the same thing as he is over here, though.
Well,
he's talking over here about.
Hold on.
But down here in 21, he's talking about Hagar and Sarah. He's not talking about.
He's also, but I mean, that's the woman or the women that he's talking about throughout this entire allegory that he starts at the end of chapter 3. So he's telling you right there that these things are to be taken figuratively, that these women represent two covenants. Like when he says that, God sent his son born of a woman, born under the law, that was Jesus being, given a body of flesh that was under the law, because you're not born under the law in Judaism. You have to be circumcised 8 days after your birth, and then you're placed under the law. If you're not circumcised, then you're actually supposed to be shunned from the Jewish society, and you're thrown out because you're no longer a Jew. So you can't technically be born under the law unless you're got a body made by God, which is already circumcised when he made it.
See, I just don't agree, though, that these are the same thoughts at the beginning of chapter, because the beginning of chapter 4, and this is where chapters and verses can be confusing because they don't have any real rhyme or reason. They were just kind of just randomly assigned all over the place. But in the beginning of chapter 4, the first 7 verses, he's still continuing his previous thought from chapter 3. And then he goes on to a new thought after that.
No, he
so
doesn't.
when he's talking about
this
Jesus
is all
being
the
born,
same argument. This entire thing is explaining Jesus's sacrifice and how we're able to attain salvation from our sins. Like it's the entire process for how that works in Christianity, and him saying that these things are to be taken figuratively. These are 2 covenants. One is the covenant from Mount Sinai, and bears children who are to be slaves. And it says right up top where it says, so you are no longer a slave, but God's child. I mean, he's still explaining the exact same concept here throughout chapter 4. I don't see how you can get around that. Like, he's explaining how you go from being a slave under the laws of Moses to being free under this new covenant that Jesus provided with his death.
Right, and that's the allegorical part. That's the allegorical
starts
part.
At the end of chapter 3 and goes all the way through chapter 4. The entire thing's an allegorical explanation for the sacrifice of Jesus.
One thing is allegorical. Okay, so I'm not a young Earth creationist. Okay, I don't believe in the biblical creation story as told in the first chapter of Genesis. Okay, I think that's allegorical. Okay, however, I do believe in a literal Adam and Eve. Okay, so just because something is allegorical doesn't mean that it's not, that it doesn't also contain, and you want to know how I can believe in Adam and Eve and not believe in young Earth creation.
That's what I'm trying to work out right now.
All right, so I am a theistic evolutionist. I believe that humans developed on the earth the same as all other animals through evolution. And I believe that around 100, 150,000 years ago, what happened was what anthropologists refer to as the Great Leap Forward, where humans became different than the rest of the animals. They stopped being wild animals and they became sentient. And I believe
that doesn't make sense because Homo sapiens actually developed in Africa around 300,000 years ago. So I don't see how that works with the timeline.
Because the Homo sapiens existed before they were sentient beings.
But I mean, we're not different species now than we were 300,000 years ago.
No, and that's where the God stuff and the miracle stuff comes in. But I believe that modern Homo sapiens, as we are right now, were once more wild animals, and we were made sentient by God at one point. And anthropology shows us where this point is. Like I said, it's called the Great Leap Forward. For some reason that anthropologists can't know or can't understand, Homo sapiens just boomed. Like as a species, we just boomed. And so for me, looking at the scientific evidence,
I'm going to need a citation for anthropologists think that we just boomed.
I can get that for you. I can't get it for you right now, but I can get it to you after we're done here. But it's called the Great Leap Forward.
Okay, this is a totally new concept to me.
You're right.
I've never heard somebody make this particular argument.
Really, you've never heard that before?
Yeah.
Okay. At any rate.
Yeah, because the Great Leap Forward actually comes up with a reference to the People's Republic of China. So
no, I'm definitely not talking about that.
I mean, that's everything as far as Google goes, as far as the Great Leap Forward is referencing China. The Great Leap Forward evolution. let's see, supposedly reflecting the evolution of meanwhile, arrival of humans in Australia 65,000 years ago shows we've mastered seafaring. The sudden flourishing of technology is called the Great Leap Forward, supposedly reflecting the evolution of the fully modern human brain, but fossils and DNA suggest that human intelligence became modern far earlier.
Right, which you said, what, you said 65,000 or 85,000 years ago?
Well, that was 65,000 years ago was when humans got to Australia. Now, I mean, this is really deviating from the whole, is Jesus a real person?
No, you're right. But I mentioned the literal Adam and Eve thing, and it looked like it got your brain turning, like you were interested in hearing more. So,
well, yeah. I mean, I still am interested in this whole Great Leap Forward and how that factors into theistic evolution. But my entire point here is that the entire thing is an allegory. It's either an allegory or it's explaining the allegory in chapter 4. And I'm not saying that this one particular section says that there's a metaphor or something like that. That means the entire thing is. I'm taking a look at the end of chapter 3 and going all the way through chapter 4. That's an entire allegorical teaching.
Okay, so also in Galatians chapter 3, Paul tells the Galatians that many of them saw Jesus crucified before their very eyes.
Where's that at?
Galatians chapter 3.
What verse, though?
Starting at the beginning of the chapter. He says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified?"
Clearly portrayed as crucified. That doesn't actually say that he was crucified, like, in front of the Jews, like, on earth or anything like that. He was clearly portrayed as being crucified. I totally get that.
But again, when you look at the context, he's admonishing them for being stupid when they saw it happen.
That's not what he says. He doesn't say you saw Jesus get crucified. He says Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as being crucified, as crucified. Now, I think in this particular verse, you can't really discern between Jesus being, or the Messiah rather, Jesus Christ, being portrayed as being crucified in the scriptures versus a hallucination versus actually being crucified in front of the Jews. Also, was Jesus crucified in Galatia?
No, he was crucified in Jerusalem.
Okay, so
but that doesn't mean that people living in Galatia at the time that Paul wrote that letter, because you're looking at 20 years later. So there could be leaders or whoever in the church in Galatia that had been sent from Jerusalem. We don't know that. All we know is he says, many of you, not all of you, but many of you.
I don't know. I mean, it says, you foolish Galatians. He's talking to all of them. Who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly betrayed as crucified. I mean, I don't see him saying many of you have seen this. Not all of you, but many of you.
Okay, so
he doesn't make a distinction there.
Okay, fair enough. I did just read that, so I don't know.
Okay. Well, so my point though is that at the end of chapter 3 there, going all the way through chapter 4, Paul is using an allegory in order to explain the sacrifice of Jesus. And so, I mean, regardless of how it's an allegory or whether he was being metaphorical or allegorical there, it's still the whole born of the woman, born under the law is a weird way to reference actually being born and being a Jew.
And even at the time of the writing, a lot of people would have felt that same way. Like, this is a weird way to phrase this. Even Peter in his epistles say that Paul's letters are hard to understand, that the dude talks around in circles, you know,
Okay.
and then that many people use this to twist the scriptures to their own destruction or whatever. So yeah, I get that you're saying that, you know, if this is what Paul means, it's a weird way of saying it. But also from biblical evidence, we can see that that was just Paul. Paul was kind of eccentric. I don't think that means that Paul didn't actually believe in a flesh and blood Jesus, because I just see too many references to that to discount that
Well,
Paul
so
that would be something that Paul would
Paul,
believe.
well, Paul, in the minimal myths position, posits that Paul did believe in a flesh and blood Jesus. It's just that he only stayed in the firmament. So it's not like a ghostly or spiritual kind of Jesus. It's a real physical Jesus.
A real physical Jesus that stayed in the firmament that doesn't exist.
Well,
Like
no,
the
I mean,
firmament,
but no,
the
to
firmament
me,
meaning the heavens.
right. Well, I mean, the firmament, like to us, the firmament doesn't exist, right?
Right.
But to Paul, it did exist. Do you agree
Because
with that?
that's not a word that we use.
What's not a word that we use?
Firmament. Like I've
Well,
actually looked into trying to, like there is no definition of that word outside the creation story. Like that word is just made up to the human language from the Bible.
well, right, but my point is that Paul believed that there was a firmament covering the earth. Paul believed that there were heavens. Paul
Right.
believed those things. Paul believed that angels were physical beings.
Right. And I'm not saying that Paul couldn't be mistaken, but what I am saying is I just don't see the references, and I still don't understand where you get the idea that Jesus only existed in the firmament from Paul's writings. Like I said, from the ascension of Isaiah, yes,
Well,
that absolutely says that there. But I don't get where you get that understanding unless you're eisegeting it into the text.
no, I'm not eisegeting anything into the text. I'm just reading Paul's words and trying to discern between Paul referencing a real physical person in history or just this this Messiah figure he had visions about. Like that's what I'm trying to discern. And so like there's is it, I can't remember which Romans passage it is. Maybe it's Romans 9:5. Paul mentions the archons of this aeon. Do you perchance remember him mentioning the archons of this aeon?
No, but I'm looking up Romans 9 to see if it's in there.
Oh
But I'm
yeah,
not
so it's
seeing
not
that in
9.
here.
It's not 9:5. It is, or wait. Hold on, I'm gonna look at the actual verse real quick. I got it in my notes. It might be in Corinthians. Oh, it's First Corinthians 2:8 is where it's at.
Do you have that in front of you, or you want me to look it up?
Yeah, well, I've got it. I'm reading NIV, but it's whatever.
Yeah, it's fine out
So
there.
it says, "We do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. No, we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." So the rulers of this age, the archons of this aeon, is a weird way to, if you wanted to refer to the Romans, he could have just said the Romans, um,
But
if
he
he
wasn't
wanted
just
to.
talking about the Romans, because it wasn't just the Romans. It was the Romans. It was Herod Antipas. It was Caiaphas and the Pharisees. Like all of the rulers of the time had a part in crucifying Christ. To be honest, the Romans had the smallest part because Pontius Pilate didn't want anything to do with that.
Well, I mean, that's if you, I mean, if you take the
He was under
Gospels
pressure from the
to be
religious
true,
leaders.
but
Right.
the Gospels don't relay that as accurately as you probably believe it to. But still, the rulers of this age, like, I mean, if he wanted to list off the people, like if I was looking to list off the people that had a hand in crucifying him, then I would just list them off. Saying the rulers of this age is a vague way to discuss it, but also, um, did Paul not consider Satan to be the ruler of the world?
I mean, I think you're putting that onto the text that you just read.
No, I'm not, because he literally says that Satan is the ruler of this world. He uses the exact same kind of phrasing there, the same way he's referencing the rulers of this age. And Paul's entire theology is surrounding the fact that Satan is the ruler of this world, and he's the ruler of this age. Like that's his entire theology of
Right,
the,
because and and I'm going to get into, a little off topic here, but when Paul references Satan being the ruler of this age, he's talking about, or the ruler of the world or whatever, he's talking about the church age, which is what we're in now, what we've been in for 2,000 years. He's talking about the devil, about Satan being free, right? Like he's free to run roughshod. It's uh in Revelation, it talks about when the 1,000 years have ended and Satan is released to tempt the masses or whatever. And so that's what Paul is talking about.
where is that in the text? Because I feel like you're just reading that into Paul's words.
Well, you are partially correct. That's not in Paul, that's in Revelation, but it's what makes sense. It's what helps understand what Paul is talking about is what's written in
So,
Revelation. Because
Revelation's written in the
Revelation,
second
everybody,
century.
or a lot of people think that Revelation is only about stuff that hasn't happened yet, and I don't believe that's true. I think a lot of the stuff that was in Revelation has been fulfilled already.
Okay, but see, Revelation was written in the second century, which was at least 50 years after Paul was writing. So I don't see how this
Right, but
helps.
just because, and again, I disagree with your dates, but even if that's true, even if I, even if I allow for a second century writing, I think it was a very late first century. But but just because something wasn't written down until later doesn't mean it wasn't understood before.
I mean, I can agree with that, but there's no evidence in Paul that he thought that.
Right, but there's
That's my
also no
point.
evidence in the passage that you just read that Paul was referring to Satan when he referred to the leaders of the age. It just
Well,
sounds like he's
because I had to
referring to the
refer
people that
to,
crucified Christ, who were the leaders of the different perspective groups that.
and that's a possibility, but it's equally possible that Paul is referring to Satan because of how Paul refers to Satan in other passages. that are relevant to what he's talking about here. It's relevant to his theology. For me, it's more parsimonious to understand it as him talking about Satan in one way or another than it is to think that, oh, he's just vaguely referencing earthly powers, because the earthly powers were not what concerned him. He didn't care about the earthly powers. He
Right.
cared about Satan and his hold on everything.
Right. But if you take the gospel accounts at face value, it was absolutely, you all right?
Oh yeah, sorry, there was like a bug or something that flew in my arm.
All right. Uh, yeah, it looked like you were getting attacked by something, fly or something.
It was
But
Satan. Don't worry about it.
if you take the 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 gospel accounts at face value, okay, I'm not saying that they have to necessarily be reliable or true, but just if you take them at face value, then it was the leaders of, of the earthly realm that crucified Christ, and I think that's all Paul is saying.
Well, like I said, I think that that's possible, but I don't think that there's evidence in Paul to, solidly make that either inference or concretely say that that's what he was talking about. I think Paul's being vague here, and ultimately, I don't think that it helps us determine who crucified Jesus or where he was crucified at. I just think that if you consider how Paul references the rulers of the world or the rulers of this age, or who Paul considers to be the ultimate enemy of the Christians, if you consider that, and then also consider Paul's theology and all that, it makes it more likely that he's talking about Satan. Now, it could be, it's also on that idea, it's also equally possible that Satan was influencing human puppets or whatnot to crucify
Right.
Jesus. And so there's a way that you could explain it there, but my point is that there's no definitive one way or another. But
So,
I
okay.
just
So would you at least say then that whether or not there was a historical Jesus is inconclusive? Because at the end of the
I
day,
think
that's all I'm concerned about in this discussion is, was there a itinerant Jewish preacher in the middle of the first century or in the early part of the first century? I guess it would be the early first century, but named Jesus, who preached somewhat many of the things that he's attributed to, or that are attributed to him, and was crucified as a criminal in history. Like, that's it. Like, I'm not trying to
okay.
defend, the gospels, the word of the gospels. I'm not trying to defend Christian theology. I'm not trying. I mean, I can do all of those things, right? We can have, but those are separate discussions. My concern is, if this person existed, if you take away all the miracle claims, if you take away all the supernatural stuff, all the religiosity out of the story, and you're just left with this plain, simple, boring story about an itinerant Jewish preacher who, may or may not have been a cult leader, was crucified as a common criminal, and then that's the end of the story. No resurrection, no nothing like that. If that person existed, do we have all the evidence that we would expect to have of that person's existence? And I think that we do. Even if
See,
you
and I'm
allow
just
for
not.
much of that, even if you allow for much of that evidence to be flourished and to be exaggerated, the evidence itself is still there and still valid. And that's what the scholarly consensus says. That's where,
No,
the
no,
scholar.
I obviously disagree with that, because I feel like we have very little evidence that Jesus might have been historical.
What
We
evidence that's reasonable would you like to have that we don't have?
Paul. Well, I mentioned this in the Holy Kool-Aid video, but just any verse in Paul that's unambiguously referencing Jesus as a historical person.
Well, and that's
Like,
why
that's
I
all.
mostly focused on Paul in this discussion, because you said in that video, in that response to Thomas, that if you could just be convinced that Paul thought Jesus was a real human being, that you would at least would give credence to the idea.
Well,
And
I
I
mean,
think absolutely it's convincing that Paul thought that.
see, I'm just not convinced like you are. I find that the verses in Paul that we talked about here tonight, those are verses that are just too vague to say one way or the other. So it doesn't
See,
affect my prior probability.
and it just seems to me, okay, and I don't want you to take this as being condescending or offensive or anything like that. But it just seems to me like you're taking the evidence that we do have and setting it to the side and saying that's not good enough. So if it's not
I mean,
good
I don't
enough,
see how you can,
what
hold on.
would you
I don't see
rather
how you
have?
can say that. I don't see how you can say that when I've been able to thoroughly explain to you why the evidence is not convincing. So
But
how is it me just setting it aside when I'm sitting here being like, you're offering me this evidence, and I'm like, no, that doesn't actually prove the conclusion. I mean, it's
be,
like when flat earthers come to me and they're like, you see Chicago from Michigan, and I'm like, no, that doesn't prove your point. It's the
right,
exact same
refraction,
thing.
mirages, yeah, you're an idiot. I get it.
Well,
But
and I
not you,
explained
but the
why
flat
it's
earthers.
not
Right.
evidence. Well, and I
Right.
explained why it's not sufficient evidence to prove the conclusion. That's
But
what I'm doing.
but
I'm
the
not just setting it
explanations that
aside.
but the explanations that you presented, I guess, to me, just aren't convincing. They sound like just explaining it away, right?
I'm not. Well, how is explaining why the evidence doesn't support your conclusion just explaining it away? I mean, we're convinced by different pieces of information, or pieces of evidence. You're more convinced of the of how typical apologists will interpret the evidence, and I'm just simply not. And so it's not me
but
just setting it
it's not
aside.
just
I have
apologists
reasons.
though. It's not just apologists though. It's almost every other historian and scholar in the field of ancient Near Eastern history. That's how they interpret the
Well, so
information.
New Testament scholars are not historians, for one. They're tangentially trained in history, but also that same group thinks that Jesus resurrected from the dead historically. So I feel
No,
like
that's
there's
not
an
true
issue.
because no,
It
because
is
there are lots of non-religious New Testament scholars that teach the New Testament in major universities. Bart Ehrman is one of them.
right. And can you name another?
I mean, I'm sure I could find more. I don't know every New Testament
You
professor.
said lots. It's like, oh my God, there's just so many of them. I can't count them on my fingers. But
That doesn't mean I
you've
know
got
them by
one. You've got
name.
Bart Ehrman.
That doesn't mean I know them by name.
Then how do you know that there's lots?
How
If
do
you
you
can't,
know that they're all Christians?
I didn't say that they were all Christians. In
You
fact, in
did
my
though.
video, I said, huh?
You did though. You just did.
No, I
At
didn't.
least that's what I heard. If I misheard you, then that's fair. But that's what I heard.
I mean, you can go back and listen to the recording. I did not say that they were all Christians. I said that New Testament scholars aren't historians, which is true. They're tangentially trained in
But
history.
there are New Testament scholars from all walks of life. There are Jews, there are Christians, there are non-religious. Like there are new.
Name me one Jewish New Testament scholar.
I mean, I know that I've seen more than one. But yeah,
Well,
I don't have everybody's name committed to memory.
no, I'm not expecting you to have everybody's name committed to memory, but like there are
Right, but
Jewish
you're saying
biblical
name these
scholars,
people.
huh?
But you're saying name these people. I mean, that wasn't something that I was prepared to do.
Well, I
Like
mean,
that just came up
but
in the conversation.
yeah, but okay, but like, look, it's a lot like me saying, oh, I know a guy in the first century who says he saw Godzilla walking around Palestine. Like,
Right.
I'm using a reductio ad absurdum, but I mean, you get what my point here is that you're like, there's just so many people that agree with this and they come from Judaism and everything like that. But I mean, whenever somebody touts out all of this, I find it like lacking. And I can literally bring up an image right now of like at least 40 scholars that are either convinced of mythicism, they're agnostic, or they're sympathetic to the mythicist position. And I could read off every single one of their names to you.
What do you mean by sympathetic?
Sympathetic meaning that it's not like the historicity of Jesus is not as concrete as people say it is. Like there's an argument to be made for mythicism.
I think anybody that's honest would say that. I think anybody that's honest would say it's not as concrete.
No, but you can't sit there and be like, oh, you're foolish if you don't think Jesus existed, and then also in the same breath say, but it's a reasonable thing to question it. Like I mean, you can't say those two things like right after the other. It's either I'm foolish for doubting the historicity of Jesus because the evidence is so strong, or there's a reasonable argument to be made, or it's reasonable to doubt the historicity of Jesus.
I didn't say the evidence. I didn't say the evidence is so strong. I said the evidence is what we would expect. Would we like to have more? Sure. We didn't have physical evidence that Pontius Pilate was a real historical person until the 1960s.
Okay, well, so I don't expect physical evidence of Jesus.
Right. And you wouldn't. You'd be foolish to expect that. But that's why I'm asking, what's reasonable that you would like to have that we don't? You said Paul. We disagree on whether or not Paul testifies to a historical Jesus. What outside of Paul? What else?
I mean, an unambiguous reference to a historical Jesus.
I mean, we have New Testament writings. We have New Testament writings, even if you discount the Gospels. All right. We have New Testament writings from eyewitnesses. We have Jude and James and John and Peter.
No. So 1 Peter might authentically come from the Peter that's mentioned by Paul. 2 Peter is not. Jude is not. James is not. The Johns, the 1, 2, and 3 John isn't. The Gospel of John isn't. Like none of those are eyewitnesses. So I mean,
but again, I don't think that the arguments for that is very strong. Like Bart Ehrman, for example. Okay, he argues that Peter could not have written the Gospel. Peter could not have written the epistles of Peter because he was a fisherman, and so he would have only spoken Aramaic and not been bilingual. Well, I think that's flimsy because you can go to San Diego. No, you can. You can go to San Diego and you can find Mexican immigrants that are fully fluent in English and Spanish and can't read or write.
So you think that the ability to read and write is the exact same now as it was in the first century? Like,
no, I don't. I think it's.
Why are you comparing?
I think it's much more uncommon to be illiterate today than it was in the first century. But I'm not talking about being able to read and write. I'm talking about being bilingual, and being bilingual has nothing. My point was that being bilingual has nothing to do with being literate. So there's no reason.
But when we're talking about the ancient world, reading and writing in a particular language is a different skill than speaking it. So
correct.
Peter could have spoke Greek. He could have also spoke Aramaic or spoken. He could have spoken those two languages. That doesn't mean
correct.
that he can read and write in Greek. Now,
correct.
Here's the argument.
But how does that preclude him from dictating to a secretary?
I'm trying. Well, I mean, you can ride that particular argument if you want to, but I feel like you would need some like better evidence in order to just ride on that particular argument. But
I think we have evidence for that.
No, but we don't. So as far as 1 Peter goes, there's 2 different Peters that we're talking about here. For one, right? There's the actual historical Peter, who was probably educated in pagan schools to read and write in Greek. And then there's the gospel Peter, the one that you're arguing for. He was an illiterate fisherman, as reported by the gospels. But when Jesus, picked him up as a disciple and everything like that, and by the time Jesus was over and done, there's just simply no time for an illiterate peasant fisherman to go to a pagan school and learn how to read and write in sophisticated Greek and produce the work that he supposedly produced.
Well, Koine Greek was not sophisticated Greek; it was common Greek.
I mean,
so
it was common Greek, but you can
New
still
Testament,
be sophisticated in common Greek. Like, you
right? But the New Testament. My point is, though, the New Testament was not written in scholarly verbiage; it was written in the vernacular of the time.
I mean,
which was Koine.
It was written in common Greek, sure, but you can still be sophisticated in writing in Greek, like, and even if it's common Greek. So, I mean, my point is that the only place that you could learn to read and write in Greek are pagan schools, and an illiterate peasant fisherman is not going to have the money or the time to go and do that.
But we have Mark, who was an associate of Peter, who wrote a gospel account. And you can say no, but again, the evidence just isn't very strong for the Gospels being anonymous. We have, and I pointed this out in the video response as well, we have an anonymous book of Scripture. We know what an anonymous book of Scripture looks like. It looks like the book of Hebrews. We still have no idea who the hell wrote that book. Nobody does. We don't know. It's anonymous.
There is not who wrote the Gospels.
No, but we do, though, because history tells us, because there has never been a single dispute about that until recently.
Until recently? I mean, come on, man. The Gospels weren't given names until the 2nd century, like the end of the 2nd century. So I don't even know what you're talking about here.
But we don't have any manuscripts where they're not named. So how do you know they weren't given? How do you know names weren't attributed to them before the 2nd century?
But what we do have are various texts that have different constructions for the title, meaning that the titles were affixed later after they had been written. The original titles for all 4 Gospels was the Gospel of Jesus.
But what we don't have is any of those Gospels, any of those titles with different authors attributed to them.
I don't think that we need different authors attributed to them, because
but that's what we would have if they were anonymous. That's what we've had with Hebrews.
No, I mean,
Hebrews has been attributed to different writers throughout the century.
Right. Hebrews had been, but that doesn't necessarily mean that just because the author, like the Gospels, never went through that, doesn't mean that they're not anonymous. For one thing, the person that set affixed the titles or identified each gospel with their titles, he's the one that set it in stone. I can't remember the church father right now. It was sometime in the second half of the 2nd century that they were given titles. They were attributed to them. I know Papias references a couple of gospels, but he's like completely wrong about the Matthew gospel. But in any case, the point is that we don't have early manuscripts where the authors like mention who authored them in the text. This is completely different from other historical works at the time. You have other historical works that directly mention who authored the book within the text, or they've always had titles affixed to them that attribute it to an author. So, I mean, I feel like this whole traditional authorship based on the titles is just a very weak case. And we're going to fundamentally disagree over these things, but that comes to the crux of why I don't think that Jesus was a historical figure, and you do.
Right.
But
I don't know.
My point is
what I was hoping from this conversation was just to be able to understand you a little bit better, I guess. Understand your point of view, because I just don't get it. And maybe it's just that you're never going to be able to understand my perspective, and I'm never going to be able to understand your perspective.
I feel like I understand your perspective. I feel like I understand your perspective. I mean, I can steel man your case. Can you steel man mine?
I don't know. I don't know that I can. I don't know that because I just don't see, like I said, to me it just, and this is just to me it just seems like the evidence is there and you're just looking past it.
How am I looking past it if I'm
Like, okay, so
well,
again,
hold on. How explain this to me? How am I just looking past it if I'm analyzing it? I'm giving you well thought out reasons as to why the evidence isn't convincing to me, and then I'm just simply not coming to the same conclusion. So,
but
like,
see, that's
how is
just
that
it though.
just looking past it?
You're not refuting the evidence. You're just saying it's not convincing to me.
No, I'm not just saying that it's not convincing to me. I'm giving you evidence as to why like your evidence doesn't support the conclusion. So, like, I'm giving you reasons as to why it doesn't support the conclusion. I mean, that's fine. You disagree with that, and you're totally, able to do that. But what I'm not doing here is just looking past this evidence. I feel like I've shown that I've intimately, like, analyzed the evidence, and there are things that I have issues with your evidence, and that's why I don't believe.
That's fair.
Okay.
I mean, that's fair. I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, like going back to the authorship of the Gospels, what would you expect, or what's reasonable that you want to have that we don't have? Like, every manuscript that we have is attributed to those authors. We don't have any manuscripts attributed to other authors. We don't have any debate about who authored them. We do have that with Hebrews. So if some church father, if some church father in the 2nd century just decided, some bishop just decided to take it upon himself, why would he assign an author to Hebrews as well?
I mean, I can't tell you what
I
he
mean,
was thinking.
I see an actual anonymous book of scripture and how that's been treated over the centuries, and I see the Gospels were not treated that way. So it just stands to reason to me, like, it just seems reasonable that we should just take at face value that they were authored by who they claim to be authored by.
But you see, we don't have, like, up until the second half of the 2nd century, we don't have any other church father quoting from the Gospels and assigning a name to them. We don't have any references anywhere that say,
So
oh,
what?
this person wrote this gospel. I mean, so there's where I'm coming from on this is from an evidence-based position. I feel like you're coming from a presumption, like you're presuming that the titles have always been affixed to them, and I'm like, well, we need evidence that they were always affixed. What evidence is there that they weren't always affixed? Oh, you mean to tell me that there are manuscripts out there where the titles are configured in completely different ways while the text basically remains the same? Well, that seems to indicate that the titles were fixed later, as they are not as stable as the actual text is. That's something
But
that you have to explain. So it doesn't make a
but
lot of
the
sense for the.
authors, but the authors are not different.
It doesn't matter.
So, like, you can go and you can buy 15 different translations of the Bible and probably have different titles for different books, right? Like one Bible might just say Matthew, right? Another Bible might say the Gospel according to Saint Matthew. Another Bible might just say,
I mean,
like, the
the
title
talk.
is
No.
irrelevant.
I
The
mean,
author is what's the structure of the title is irrelevant. The
it's
attributed
not.
author, but it is though.
No, it isn't. I mean, because the reason why it is important is because the rest of the text is stable, whereas the title is not. In the Greek words that are used to label the book, to label the gospel, it's constructed differently, showing that it's not as stable as the text that it's been tacked onto.
Right, and I would absolutely agree that originally the Gospels did not have titles. None of the books of the New Testament have titles, right? when they were written, none of them had titles. It's not like Luke sat down and said, the gospel according to Luke, chapter 1. It's not, no, of course not. But the authorship has always been understood as being, and with Hebrews it hasn't. And I think that's relevant. I
don't think that it's relevant. And I mean, the titles were only affixed or at least associated to each respective gospel in the later part of the 2nd century. So I don't understand. Like, that's the first time where specific quotes from specific gospels are attributed to specific authors. So I'm just simply not convinced by your evidence. I would need to see actual evidence that the gospels are eyewitness accounts, because from what I can tell, the gospels only get their information from scripture, because that's where they say they get their information from. And so you keep talking, hold on. You keep talking about how the evidence is exactly as we would expect it if Jesus actually came, died, and resurrected and all this other stuff. But the problem that I see in the Gospels, at least, is that the only independent, pseudo-independent gospel you have is Mark. And Mark definitely got a lot of his theology and a lot of his information from the Old Testament, but he's also been shown to have gotten his information from Paul as well. So it doesn't seem like there's any actual historical basis to the Gospel of Mark. And then all those problems translate on into Matthew, into Luke, and into John, because they all use Mark's material.
John does not use Mark's material. That's what I was going to ask you. Like, just out of curiosity, why do you think John is not an independent gospel? Because John is not considered one of the synoptic gospels. John,
well, that's only because he tells a different story, but it's very obvious in the Gospel of John that he is responding to the previous gospels that were written. And so he does things like he totally flips different points that are made in, like, the Gospel of Luke. Like, for instance, Gospel of Luke has a Lazarus that's a parable that's told by Jesus. And then in the Gospel of John, he totally does away with the whole Luke's Lazarus thing, turns Lazarus into a real person that really is resurrected. And while the message of the Gospel of Luke is that even a resurrected person won't convince people that, you know, Jesus is Lord or whatever, while in John, a resurrected individual immediately converts people. So, I mean, there's multiple points in the Gospel of John where it's very obvious that he knows the previous Gospels, considering that he was written in the 2nd century, or in your case, after all the other Gospels. The timeline works with John being able to use the other Gospels.
Okay. Like I said, I was just curious why you would not think that John was an independent account, because historically that it has been seen as the only independent gospel account, because the other three are very noticeably tied together. And yes, they do seem to stem from Mark. Now, whether Luke wrote before Matthew or Matthew wrote before Luke, but that's another thing. That's another internal thing that gives credence to the authors that they're attributed to, right? So Matthew, in the story of the Gospels, was a tax collector. And when you read the Gospel of Matthew, it has an emphasis on money. It feels like it's read by somebody who was an economist, which a tax collector would have been. The same thing with the Gospel of Luke. Luke is said to have been a physician. And when you read Luke's Gospel, Luke writes things that from the perspective of how a physician would write them, or how a doctor would write them. So it just seems to me like there's overwhelming circumstantial evidence, granted, but there's overwhelming circumstantial evidence that lends credence to the authors that we attribute those books to.
So if you could figure, or whoever could figure out that those were the perspectives that the Gospels were being told from, or at least it has elements of those in it, do you not think that somebody that's looking at the Gospels 100 or more years after they were written could have been like, oh, well, who wrote this gospel? Well, it reads like a tax collector wrote it. Oh, well, we got Matthew. He's a tax collector. And then for Luke, it's like, well, it looks like a physician wrote this stuff. I could barely read it. Oh, well, we got this one guy here, Luke. He obviously was the physician. So, I mean, he wrote it. Like, you don't think that later on people couldn't have like taken up on these clues and been like, oh, well, this person must have done it. And
do I think that's possible? Sure. I don't think it's likely, though. I don't think it's likely when you look at how the anonymous book of Hebrews was treated throughout the centuries. There are a lot of people, and when you read Hebrews, I know, yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, but that I think that, again, that's relevant. How Hebrews has been treated through the centuries is relevant because that's a truly anonymous book of scripture.
I mean, it is an anonymous book of scripture, but also the Gospels were anonymous prior to some church father giving them names.
But just because the names weren't written on them doesn't mean that we didn't know who wrote them.
I mean, I can agree that the early, like, if there were eyewitnesses that wrote them, which I sincerely doubt, but if there were, then I agree that it doesn't preclude them from being there. But what I'm saying, and my entire point, is that we don't have evidence of this. We don't have evidence of eyewitness accounts in the Gospels. What we have are evidence of fictional creations.
Okay. I mean, I just, again, I don't agree with that. You know, obviously, you knew I wasn't going to agree with that. But
right. But can you at least acknowledge that what I'm saying here comes from scholarship? Like, there's scholarship out there that asserts this.
I mean, so, like, yeah,
I've compared.
Even if, and he's not, Richard Carrier is probably the only, at least that I've come across. Maybe you know more scholarly mythicists than I do, but Richard Carrier is the only one that I've come across that has any kind of higher education credentials. But even if Richard Carrier was the only one, then yeah, I'd have to say there is some scholarly work done that you're using. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
No, I mean,
and obviously Richard Carrier is not the only one. He just seems to have been the originator of the whole thing, or at least the popularizer. He claims, though, he does claim to be the originator of the mythicist theory.
Well, no. So he's claimed that that he's the first one to write a substantial analysis of the historical Jesus in 100 years, and he's the first one to write a substantial analysis of the mythicist hypothesis in 100 years. But
okay.
I mean, there's evidence of the like what mythicists are claiming. There's evidence of that in, you know, like 2 Peter, Justin Martyr, Ignatius of Antioch. Like there's evidence of people you know, thinking the same things that we're saying early on in church history or Christian history.
Okay. I mean, I don't obviously I don't have all of Saint Ignatius of Antioch's writings committed to memory, but from what I've read in Ignatius and Justin Martyr, I don't see that. Now, granted, I've read the early church fathers from the perspective of a Catholic that's trying to make Protestants understand that their church didn't exist prior to 500 years ago. Right, that prior to 1,000 years ago, all we had was this one Christian church. Like, that's how I read the church fathers, is from that perspective. So I'm not saying those things aren't in there. I'm just saying I haven't read them that way.
Right.
So
I was gonna bring it up, but like the 2 Peter, which wasn't written by Peter, I know that we disagree on that, but in 2 Peter, it actually has a particular passage where it's like, We did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of Jesus Christ. We were eyewitnesses to his majesty. So that it's the same thing for Justin Martyr and for Ignatius of Antioch. This emphasis of this idea that like, oh, we're not following myths, we're not following cleverly devised stories. This is stuff that actually happened. I promise. But
so for you, the flat out statement that we are not spreading rumors is evidence that they were in fact spreading rumors.
That's not what I said. That's not what 2 Peter says. It says, for we did not follow cleverly devised stories. Like,
right.
That's what it said. Like, it's saying we're not following cleverly devised stories, but yeah, it goes on to make up.
So hold on. So let me, so just so I can understand what you're saying, you're saying that because Peter or whoever wrote that epistle felt it necessary to say we didn't make this up is evidence that at least some people thought it was made up at the time of that writing.
Well, well, yeah. I mean, I think that
I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Okay.
It's like the fact that, you know, this church council, the Council of Nicaea, let's take for example, the fact that they felt it necessary to say Jesus is 100% man and 100% God obviously means that there were people at that time who were calling bullshit. So I agree with that. Okay.
Well, I mean, you got Ignatius, like I said, you got Ignatius of Antioch and Justin Martyr, who also are saying these things. And to go back to one thing, and maybe we can end on this, but
okay,
you were talking about how if Jesus actually died and resurrected, we would have the stuff like that we have now as far as evidence goes. But as far as I can tell, Paul only references scriptures and visions as his sources of information. The Gospels, they only cite scripture as the source of their information. And then, of course, anything after the Gospels is going to be influenced by the Gospels. So, like, it seems to me, from my perspective, that if Jesus didn't come and wasn't crucified here on earth, and that he was only perceived through visions and scripture to have been crucified in the heavens, it seems like we would have all the exact same stuff that we have now. Like, I can't think of one single thing that can't be derived from the scriptures or from some guy's hallucinations.
But again, and that just comes off to me as presuppositionalism. And I know that you will say that, but that's how it sounds to me. It sounds like you're saying,
I don't care how it sounds to you. What I'm saying is that Paul says these things, the Gospels say these things. This is the evidence that we have. So I'm not presuming anything.
But you're looking at it through a certain lens, though. And I get that. I'm looking at it through a certain lens as well. But you're looking at it through
I'm looking at it through a historical lens.
Like, no, because you're saying
lens that I'm looking at.
No, because you're saying that the evidence that we have, that we would expect to have, that, you know, that the evidence that we have is no different than the evidence we would also have if this other thing is true. But the only reason why that other thing is a hypothesis is because, like, okay, the only you're not agnostic on the topic, right?
I would not portray myself as agnostic, no.
Right. So you believe firmly that Jesus was not a real historical figure, that he's, you know, that he's fiction, he's a fictional character.
Well, technically, I would say that I think that he probably didn't exist, that he was a celestial. He was perceived as a celestial being by Paul.
Okay. But your evaluation of the evidence is seen through that lens of what you already believe. And I'm not saying that's not valid and that's not fair. I'm just saying that's how it looks to me. That's how I see your argumentation.
Well, I mean, I feel like maybe you need to clean out your ears or something, because that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I've looked at the background information to to like Judaism and Christianity and all of that, and I've developed a prior probability for this savior figure of Christianity, and that prior probability ends up being about 33%, 1/3, like that. That's just using the background information, how all that factors in. And then we have to analyze, well, what evidence do we actually have? And so we start going through the various pieces of evidence that we do have, isolating the independent accounts about this Jesus figure, which really only resolves to Paul, because the gospels aren't independent, at least as far as like the critical scholarship goes. They're not independent of Paul. So really, you've just got Paul's letters. Does Paul contain anything that could solidly place us in the historical category? Oh, well, he's got up all these verses, but they're all too vague, and so they don't really move the needle all that much on our prior probability. So we end up with 1/3 probability, and that's primarily based on like the rank Raglan mythotype, as well as the adherence of Christianity to mystery religion structure. Like all of that places it firmly in this category where generously 1/3 of people that meet this particular category can be said to be historical. And so that leaves 2/3 of it most likely mythical, which is where the mythicist position lays. So it starts out with background information, it sets that up, and then we, regardless of the background information, we take a look at what the current evidence is, and we evaluate that. And then, given our background information, we evaluate what effect the evidence has on that, and then we come to a conclusion. So I'm not looking at it through any kind of lens other than the basic historical method.
Okay. Okay. That's fair.
Right. The
At the
only other
very
thing
least,
that, go ahead.
I was going to say, at the very least, I think this conversation is at least a little bit more entertaining than the one that you had with Trent Horn a couple days ago, because
yeah,
that one
probably.
was just like, yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, Trent was a little disappointed in our conversation, but the only other thing that I really wanted to address was you claimed that I quoted Robert Van Voorst out of context, but I wanted to clear that up, that I was quoting his conclusion on Tacitus, because this, for people that don't know, there was a section in Tacitus, and I usually pull out the conclusion paragraph to the section that Robert Van Voorst has on Tacitus, where he lays out his final conclusion of his determination about the evidence. And so I felt like you were saying, oh, you're quote mining this, like you're just pulling this out randomly for no reason because it seems to support your position, when I'm looking at Robert Van Voorst's conclusion about Tacitus, and I agree with it, and so I'm using that.
Okay. I mean,
so,
like, I remember responding to that part in the video, and I remember using other arguments that he did use in that same book, which supported the Tacitus view. But again, I don't have those quotes in front of me right now. So,
well, right, but wouldn't you say his final conclusion about the source matters more than whatever kind of dialogue he has about the evidence prior to that?
I think for the most part that's true, but at the same time, all right, so I just did a video last night where I referenced St. Augustine, and it was about the reference was in regards to trying to remember what it was. Some Protestant. The video I did last night that I uploaded this morning was responding to Doug Batchelor, who's a moron. But at any rate, the whatever the topic was, which I know as soon as we're done here, it's going to come to me. I'm going to feel like an idiot. But Saint Augustine had his conclusion on the topic, but then he also left it up to the reader to decide what they thought was more probable. So just because an author has a conclusion to something doesn't mean that you necessarily have to think that the evidence that they presented really leads to that. That's just where it led them.
Okay, is that what Robert Van Voorst said at the end of the section on Tacitus?
No, but again, I think the evidence on Tacitus was stronger. The evidence he presented himself on Tacitus was stronger than he was giving it credit for.
Okay, I mean, that's fine to have that opinion, but my point was that Robert Van Voorst was came to the conclusion that Tacitus is not like, we can't verify the independence of Tacitus like from the Gospels and from the Christian community. So like that was, and he wasn't the only one. Him and RT France both agree with that position, and that seems to be like what should be the mainstream position, in my opinion.
But it's
about
not
Tacitus.
But it's not the mainstream.
I mean,
position.
I would need to gauge that. I don't know. I don't know how many historians or New Testament scholars.
At least in my research, it just seemed like Tacitus is kind of, yeah, whatever. Which Josephus, again, coming from atheist research, not reading Christian opinions on the topic. But most atheists seem to be like Thomas and just be like, yeah, whatever, who cares? Like that just seems to be the consensus. Like as far like Josephus, okay? You think that the passage in Josephus Antiquities 18 is completely inserted? It's not. It's tampered with, absolutely, and probably about half of it has been added. But the bare mention of Jesus and Pontius Pilate and the crucifixion seems to be, at least as far as scholars go, seems to be at least authentic.
That's just an ad populum argument. You're just saying that, all these scholars agree.
Well, no, I mean, I'm going by the consensus, though.
That's
and like we said at the beginning, but like we said at the beginning of this video, like the consensus matters. Like if you're going to go against the academic consensus, I mean, this isn't just an opinion poll. This is the academic consensus of people in the field.
Right. And there are academics that challenge that consensus. So we have to shift from looking at the consensus to looking at the arguments that are used to come to the conclusion of the consensus.
There are academics that disagree with the scientific consensus. There are scientists that disagree with the scientific consensus on climate change. Do you think that that they should not be placed in a position, because they're clearly the minority? Do you think they should not be placed in a position where they have to prove why the consensus is wrong?
I think that they do have to prove why the consensus is wrong. And that's what the scholars that disagree with Josephus having mentioned.
And that's where I'm coming from. And I just don't think that the evidence. Yeah, go ahead.
No, but I feel like you're totally just disregarding the fact that what I'm saying is that scholars are challenging the evidence. They are presenting their own evidence against the consensus. And when you weigh the two explanations, it seems more likely that Josephus just simply didn't mention Jesus. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that the scholars have presented their own case. They've presented their own positive claim about it, and they've substantiated it with evidence. And so,
but the evidence pertains to the part that we both agree has been interpolated or tampered with.
No, I mean the evidence that we're talking about is the entire passage. Alice Wheatley shows that the entire passage as it exists is the only one that's ever existed. And then you've got other scholars out there that have done analyses on the wording in the Josephine passage, and has shown that the wording, the word structure, the story structure, the verbs that are used, the placement in Josephus's work, all of it just does not match Josephine's style or the way he uses words or anything like that. Like, I mean, there's substantial evidence against an original like authorship for that particular passage.
Okay.
Yeah. But in any case, we've been going for about an hour and 40 minutes. I really appreciate you coming on, Will.
I
to
appreciate
talk.
you having me.
Yeah,
And even though our discussion has been adversarial in moments, I don't think this was a bad discussion. I'm not going to go away thinking, man, that guy John is a fucking prick. Like that's just not gonna.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get that either. Like from you, like I feel like we disagree on stuff, but I mean,
Right.
I hold
Which,
no ill will
again, to
towards
me
you or
is
anything.
more entertaining. Like I watched that Trent Horn just uploaded that video either today or yesterday, that conversation that you had with him a few days ago. And I was watching, I was like, oh my God, this is boring.
Well, that's why Trent was actually not like, he was a little on the fence about whether or not he should upload it or not. And
Right.
he told me that he wants to have a further discussion on the evidence in
On
Paul.
Paul. Yeah. Yeah.
So we'll probably be doing a discussion on that in the future sometime.
I'm sure Trent will do a much better job on Paul than I did. He's a much smarter guy than I am. So
Well, I mean, really, it just takes like, a lot of like researching and looking at the scholarship, like the actual. I'm not talking about like blogs that random person has put up. I'm like actual academic blogs, academic scholarly papers, and all this other stuff. Like it just takes a lot of time and reading, and I've been doing this for like 10 years or something like that. So I've just had a lot of time.
But all right, well, I had a great time. So
yeah, I had a great time too. Thank you so much there, Will, for coming on. If anybody wants to go and check out Catholicism WOW, you just search it up there in the YouTube bar. I'll get a link down in the description for anybody that wants to check out.
My profile picture is the Buddy Christ. So
yes, it's the Buddy Christ. But in any case, we'll see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good stuff. Bye, everybody.